So welcome everyone to the Evenings with Hulings virtual salon. It is an ongoing program of the Clark Hulings Foundation. CHF is a nonprofit that promotes the legacy of painter Clark Hulings by equipping visual artists to be self-sustaining entrepreneurs. We're interested in artists' livelihoods from frescoes to Facebook. I want to say a big thank you to Shirley Holland for underwriting this series up to this point. We're looking for further support so we can continue events like this one. We appreciate everyone in the room who's already given. If you like what you've heard today, please consider making a contribution at clarkhulingsfoundation.org/give. I'm just going to throw that into the chat here for a moment. Please add your questions as we go to the chat. We may take a few of them during the event, and we'll open up about 10 or 15 minutes of a Q&A at the end. And as I mentioned at the top, please make sure that your mics are muted when you're not speaking. And now I would like to introduce our guest today. We are so happy to welcome curator, art historian, and Egyptologist Dr. Clare Fitzgerald of NYU's Institute of the Study of the Ancient World, and James D. Balestrieri, author of the upcoming Hulings book and the recent Antiques in the Arts Weekly article, Mirror Dimension, Pompeii in Color, The Life of Roman Painting. Thank you so much for being with us today. And now I will hand the mic over to Jim and Claire.
Thank you, Penelope. Hello, Claire. It's great to see you. Looking forward to this. I want to, I'm just looking at the screen right now. And that was such a fantastic exhibition. And as I'm looking at the screen, I'm thinking about this painting. But I want to jump in with my favorite painting in the exhibition, which is the painting of the woman painting. And it's such a fantastic work. There it is right there. And what struck me is I'm not sure I've ever seen an earlier painting of a woman painting. And I'd love it if you would, I know what I think, but I would love it if you would kind of walk us through this and give us some idea of the circumstances under which this painting might have been executed, for whom, and anything you can tell us about it.
Sure. Thank you, Penelope and Jim, for inviting me and for that lovely introduction. And I had the pleasure of meeting Jim and his daughter when they came to look at our exhibition Pompeii in Color, which we just finished de-installing and sent back to Naples on Monday. So all the stuff is back. But this painting, which was included in the exhibition, was one which really drew people, and myself as well. I think that this is a painting which, again, is a fresco painting, which comes from the wall of a house called the House of the Surgeon. It's called the House of the Surgeon because a great number of medical tools were found inside that house. And so in all likelihood, it was probably the home of a surgeon or a medical doctor. But its subject, I think, is the thing that really draws people. I don't know if you can see my my cursor, my little arrow when I point to it, or no?
I can see it, Claire. It's teeny, but
I know it's really small. I'm sorry. So at the center here, we have a woman, a seated woman. You can tell that she is dressed in sort of elite Roman costume. This is the sort of thing that an elite Roman woman would wear. She's wearing this sort of very beautiful, purpley colored overgarment, and she has a paintbrush, which she's dipping into her paint box here. The sort of idea here is that she has either just put this panel painting that she's painting down here, and before her is a sculpture. So we have a couple different things going on. The sort of idea here is that she's painting a sculpture. So we have a painting of a woman painting a sculpture. And that kind of that sort of self-referential imagery is something that the Romans really liked. It provided an opportunity for kind of intellectual play that sort of allowed people to think about the nature of images, and their relationship to reality, but also sort of so those sorts of conversations were things that Romans were interested in. The question that we have with this painting, or that many people ask when they see this painting, is, were women painters in ancient Pompeii, let's say? And here we have a really important sort of thing to remember. The images that we see in Pompeii from the walls of elite homes do not represent, aren't really genre paintings in the way we might think of them. So they're not necessarily meant to represent daily life in a sort of direct way. They're meant to be sort of signals to people about a number of things about the homeowners. They're meant to be points of sort of discussion, to offer sort of an entry point for discussion. And so while we don't know that, we certainly don't know of any women wall painters, but then again, we don't really know the names of any male wall painters either.
Yeah.
But there's nothing to really suggest that women were wall painters. However, panel painting like this was one of a few sort of appropriate elite pastimes for women. So I kind of liken it to, when it was a sort of appropriate thing for women to do needlework or something like that. This was something that an educated sort of elite woman could partake in. But also in the same room, we have another woman represented writing in a similar panel. And so here we also then have to sort of put it into another possible context, which is that this woman is sort of a representation of the art of painting, as the other woman is a representation of the art of writing. So this room, that is a small sort of room off the side of the main sort of axis of the home, and could have been used as sort of a multi-purpose room, an office, these sorts of things. So that's sort of, it would be appropriate to have that sort of those sorts of representations in that kind of space. So the thing that I find really difficult about being an ancient art person is that we're always looking for something of something like a snapshot of the people from thousands of years ago. And it can be very alluring and very difficult when maybe that's not exactly what they're showing us. It's not to say that these objects don't reflect something of the reality of the past, but we have to be really kind of careful about how we kind of consider that, I guess.
I mean, if I can jump in, it's also
Please.
interesting that the two women who are watching this woman paint.
Mhm.
So there's a whole set of, watching a woman painting a painting of a sculpture of a man. And
Mhm.
then the second time I came to see the show, I actually looked at the little thing hanging on the wall there, which is a painting.
Yeah.
It's a painting hanging, and it's askew, and it's just on a nail. So it looks like maybe she finished that one and it's hanging. I mean, it's your idea of this being a moment in time is really fascinating. And it sort of sums up the idea of Pompeii, which is that a lot of things were sort of captured at a single moment in time, at the time of the eruption. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, because a lot of times I just did something on Stonehenge and realized that there's gaps to fill in that are hundreds of years, sometimes 1,000 years. And I'm sure for Egyptology, that can be in your field, that can be the same. But here there's this like synchronic, like everything stopped at a single moment. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of challenges and the interesting things about that kind of situation as an
Yeah,
art,
certainly.
yeah.
Certainly. So Pompeii is a place that is really, or Pompeii and the sites like it along the Bay of Naples are really unparalleled in the type of preservation that occurred there. the thing that I think, when there are a couple things that I think kind of make this a little bit more interesting, I think, is that Pompeii was a place that had a lot of geological activity always. They always were sort of sitting beside Vesuvius, and it was prone to earthquakes. There were different types of eruptions that had happened over the years. And so one thing that we know is that, as we came up toward sort of the day in 79, there were probably a number of large tremors, other sorts of signals that there was about to be an eruption. Of course, no one could have conceptualized how big, how serious, how catastrophic it was going to be. But much of the city, most of the people who lived in the city probably left before the actual eruption occurred. Also, there's a lot of debate about what day exactly this happened on. Used to be said that it was in the summer. Some people now think more it's in the fall. But also, Pompeii was a place that people, the sort of elite, came for their summer homes. So also, many people were sort of not in town. I think of it as like the Hamptons of Rome. But so the city was sort of unusual anyway. We tend to take these sites that are preserved and consider them to be sort of typical. And yet Pompeii is, like any place else, sort of very unique, even before it was sort of frozen in time. Mm-hmm. When the eruption occurred, what's interesting too is that the character of the eruption and the ash that fell in different parts of Naples, or the Bay of Naples, preserved different things at different sites. So for example, at Pompeii, there was extremely fine ash, and but it burned up all wood and elements like that. So we have sort of that material is not preserved at Pompeii, which is one of the reasons why when you look at the homes in Pompeii, you get this sense that everybody was a minimalist, and that, there was no furniture anywhere, and it kind of has this very elegant, sort of restrained look, when of course in reality it would have been awash in furniture and textiles and all sorts of other things. It would have been really kind of visually overwhelming, particularly the style of kind of decoration which was popular at the time of the eruption. So there would have been sort of a visual, just riotous stuff. But at Herculaneum, which is not too far away, the nature of the ash that fell there actually did preserve wood. So we have a whole different group of sort of types of material that were preserved there, which give us different sorts of information. One of the things that really contributes, I think, most to this notion of the place frozen in time is the images that for many people are the first thing they think of when they think of Pompeii, which are the casts of people who died there. All of us probably have seen those images, and they're very affecting, they're very evocative, and really kind of difficult images. But also Pompeii, in the immediate aftermath of the eruption, people who lived there went back to try to salvage things. There were also people who had been digging holes around and trying to, robbers who came later. But because Pompeii was different also than Herculaneum, which was where they first uncovered sort of in a more systematic way the preservation of that material, where the ash is very, very deep. At Pompeii, it's much shallower. And so they were able to uncover even more from that site with less sort of danger. The image that I show you on the bottom right, it shows you in the green is all the areas that are not yet excavated at Pompeii.
Wow.
So a great deal of Pompeii still remains unexcavated. Wow. And to go back to your question about sort of what does the sort of frozen and amber thing do, one thing that it does is it's a huge responsibility, because as soon as you uncover something, you become responsible for it forever. And we are limited, of course, by the technology that we have right now, our understanding of chemistry, all sorts of different things. And what Pompeii as a site can really track is sort of the development of the fields of archaeology and conservation, because very few sites have been worked on continuously since the 1700s.
Right.
So it actually sort of maps the history of those disciplines. And the hope is that in the future, people will be looking back on us and say, oh, isn't it funny that that's how they thought that they should treat this object once they unearth, more of Pompeii. So the sort of frozen in time part of it is true in a sense. But also, the people who lived here came back. The
Right.
site was still active.
So what you're talking about is sort of continuous sort of eruptions and small eruptions, and it's geologically active, and yet the people who live there want frescoes on their walls, which are not portable art.
Yeah.
So the art is being painted and probably repainted and probably, as time goes on. So if you're, what can we infer about the artists of that time, how they worked, how they got their jobs, their gigs, and so forth, just from the, what we know of the visual works that we have. If they're sort of working under these kinds of conditions all the time, where people want new things, or there's been an eruption and they need something redone, or so forth. What can we say?
Yeah, generally, again, eruptions, especially at the scale, were much, but earthquakes were common, and we know that actually about 10 years previous to 79, there was a very large earthquake in the area, and there was still signs of people remodeling and still, recovering even from that. So it was, kind of a difficult, I guess, a difficult, geologically difficult place to be. But the artists, what we know about the way that artists worked here was that, they were workshops. So there were at any given time a number of sort of fresco workshops working in the area. How you decided who you wanted to paint your house is something that we often ask about. It's hard to know. I think that there's some understanding that, you would go to someone's house and you would see they have a beautiful painting in their dining room, and you say, who did your who did your kitchen? And that I think was common. A lot of, because the way homes operated in Rome more broadly, but definitely at Pompeii, is that your home was the place where you worked. It was the place where you also participated in sort of daily social rituals, where your clients would come to you and you would give gifts in order to maintain their sort of loyalty. But it's also where you entertained colleagues, people, feasting and hosting, and all of those things was really important to your sort of social success. So your home was a stage for all of that. So you wanted in your home to represent not only the values of your family, how erudite you were, how intelligent you are, the references, how beautiful, what your good tastes you had, but also, sometimes you used the styles of wall painting to speak to how ancient your family was. So the way that the wall painting is sort of divided by scholars, going back to August Mao, so a very long time ago, is that we have first style, second style, third style, fourth style. Fourth style painting is what was in fashion in 79. So inevitably, that's the stuff we have the most of.
Right.
First style wall painting is very different. And we see people who are actively restoring their first style wall painting in their houses while putting in new wall painting. And that's a way of showing, my family is so ancient. Look, it's like, again, people who you go into their house, there's a bunch of colonial furniture or something.
Right.
And these statements were implicit in your preservation of wall painting. But as you say, also you wanted to show that you were also up with the most recent trends. So I think that, as with anyone's home, that kind of curation, for lack of a better word, was very much at play for them. And there were workshops of artists who were, who were there to meet those needs.
Right. Do you think that there were, if there were sort of studios, do you think there were artists who specialized in the figure and other artists specialized in architecture, painting, or did you get that sort of feeling that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So we know from sort of slightly later, and I'm gonna just hop ahead to an image so you can look at
Okay.
something pretty while I talk.
Okay.
um, we know from later that contracts that show that the person who painted the central panel, the central narrative panel, was called an Imaginarius, and that was a person who was paid at a higher level than the person who did sort of these side elements. Oftentimes these side elements included things like images of columns and attenuated architecture and little cherubs and things like that. And so depending on what part you were responsible for, you would be paid at a different rate. So there was sort of a hierarchy within the teams within the workshops. But while we know that there was a huge Greek community and a lot of Greek influence in Pompeii even before Roman control, there is the understanding that perhaps a lot of, there were also, Greeks who came to work in Pompeii, as well as local people, as well as people perhaps from Rome. So it probably was a relatively international sort of group of
Right.
people.
So and somebody just asked an interesting question and asked about the pigments, and I know that we actually, I saw some in the exhibition, and there were some interesting things about even certain colors, like the color purple, where we, there you go, where we kind of know. And I'd love it if you talk about that a little bit, and some of these tools as well, and that piece of wall, which of course is key.
Sure. So here, these objects all were in the exhibition, and they were really important because, going back to the idea that certain things were preserved at Pompeii because of the circumstances of its destruction that are really exciting and really unusual. There's one house in Pompeii called the House of the Interrupted Painter, or the House of the Painters at Work. And in this house, we see, sorry? Oh, sorry. We see that whenever it happened, the painters had to flee the space immediately and left their tools, their pots of pigment, everything. And so we have this kind of incredible document that shows us what tools they were working with, what pigments they were working with, and even you have the sketch underneath the final fresco is called a synopia, and that's preserved, as well as, even my favorite, are the holes in the wall that were driven into the wall to hold the scaffolding, because you'd start at the top of the wall and work down. The wood of the scaffolding has burned away, but you can see the holes. So like, this is an incredible sort of like photo of this moment. And so these objects here, which nobody really believed, I think, when they're in the gallery, these are not replicas of ancient pigments. These aren't, this is actual pigment in its actual, pot from 79 CE. It's hard to wrap our minds around that, I think, that this type of preservation, this sort of thing could remain, but it can. The two examples that we have here are examples of materials of pigments that were a little bit more precious, let's say. Some people talk about Pompeian red. Pompeian red is a sort of orangey red that is sort of, again, synonymous with Pompeii. That is made using a red ochre, which is a common sort of pigment which you see in the area. That was not an expensive pigment, but is very bright and is very heavily used. These two pigments, this blue is called Egyptian blue, and it was developed, the technique for creating it was developed in Egypt, but moved around the Mediterranean. And the other one is even more valuable, and that is murex. Murex was a pigment made from the I always have to like say this carefully, the shell of a carnivorous sea snail. And so it was a process of sort of you know, pulverizing the shell and then using it creates that purple color. So this purple color again was a sign of wealth. If you used a lot of purple, you know, it was a signal that you were very you know, you were wealthy. But the other thing about this that's interesting is that, again, from slightly later contracts, we see that the contracts said, well, you know, in engaging this workshop, you're engaging them for the work and the materials for the painting of your wall. And then there's a clause that says, except if you want murex or cinnabar or these colors, which are so much more valuable, that's over and above all of this. And so those contracts look very much like ones that we would see today. You know, if you want the nicer fixtures on your bathroom or whatever, you know, that is over and above what you agreed to. You know, so it's nice to know that people don't change that much. But these pigments, you know, again, are 2,000 years old, if you can believe it, and you know, you could use them today if you wanted to.
Can you talk a little bit about the drawing too and on the wall?
Sure, yeah. So this is a little bit hard to read, but what's interesting here is that you see that you have an image of actually I'm gonna pull up a different slide, which will be a little clearer. Okay. Now this is hard to read. I know my images sometimes it's hard, but this beneath this is actually the last plaster layer on this wall fell off. So this is just sort of under the final layer of plaster. And this is where an artist is working out an architectural composition. What you can see here, it's a little difficult, but you can see a red line going like this and a red line going like this. In order to create those sort of horizontal and vertical, artists would dip a string in pigment and pluck it back against the wall. And when it rebounded, it would make that straight line to sort of orient them. Then here you can see them working out, you know, sort of some different architectural elements. Something like this would ultimately become something like this, which is these sort of fictive views outside, which are perspectively pretty rigorous. People often ask if this is single point perspective, and the answer is, although the Romans certainly understood that concept, it's not exactly as refined perhaps as we see in later periods, but there's definitely, it's internally logical, you know, this sort of perspective. The other thing which is really difficult here, this is like the worst image ever, and it's just so hard to find a good image of this, but I don't know if you can see here, this is the center of the wall, this is the house of which I spoke, this is the hole where the scaffolding was driven into the wall in order to create this piece. And then here you can see the synopia. So this is the sketch over to sort of guide the artist after they applied the final layer of plaster. This was what was sort of going to guide you to create that final image. So again, the sorts of things that we have to look at here are really unparalleled. We see synopia only next in the Renaissance. We have a huge period where we don't have this sort of document. So again, thanks Pompeii. Your trauma is our, you know, gift, I suppose.
Yes. So there's definitely a sense of scaling up from something smaller.
Yeah, this is a good question. So yeah. I can jump to another. So in certain places, we know that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to make everyone nauseous. We know that grid systems are used in different periods. The Egyptians, of course, were really fond of a grid system in order to sort of lay material out and move smaller things to a larger scale, or to create, or to keep everything in the correct scale over long spaces. Here, what we see is something perhaps a little bit different, even though we imagine that there is some sort of grid system used to translate pieces, to translate images from a smaller scale to a wall. We just don't have the same type of evidence. So this is a good example here. We have these two paintings come from two different houses. They're rendered by two different workshops. And yet we can see that these central four figures, and we can say perhaps some others, are identical to one another. In the center, we have this male figure, another male figure grabbing, another male figure reaching around, and then another standing behind. This sort of quartet suggests, it doesn't suggest to us, it sort of proves to us something that we don't have direct evidence for, but that artists were using pattern books or figure books to sort of communicate about different compositions. Now, this is, again, and for all of the artists in the room, this is a really good example of how, you know, two people can have the same sort of raw material to work with and do something very different with it. But in this story, we have.
Can I interrupt? Are
Sure,
these
please.
two different styles? You're talking about the four styles of Pompeii. Are they two different? No.
They're both fourth style, but
Okay.
I'll be honest with you, the difference between third style and fourth style mostly comes from the type of things that go around the central narrative scenes.
Okay.
So what happens with the fourth and third and fourth style is you kind of all of those little you know, swags and little columns and things just get like more and more kind of Baroque. And so a lot of times the difference between third and fourth style isn't really that, you know, isn't really seen so much in these types of images.
So were executed about the same time, you would think, close.
Yes. Yes.
Which is interesting because, you know, the sort of whole history of illustration and modern illustration, it, you know, revolves around reference, like you say, books, right? And then people using those images and saying, look, you know, that guy's, and would they have used models, or would they have sort of had sort of ideal things like sculptures, do you think, in mind? Do we know?
Yeah, there is a lot of discussion about sort of physical ideals, and sculptors who are rendering physical ideals. I think that here what we have is a couple different things going on. We have the broad compositions, and a lot of the iconography is determined or communicated about through pattern books or figure books. Because sometimes we see, and I say figure books because sometimes what we see are, you can have the same figures deployed in a different story, but they are the same trio or whatever that they also use for Venus and Mars and something else. So sometimes there's some flexibility in that, and sometimes this is how you render this scene. When thinking about reference, we do have sort of the way in which our artists are obviously communicating about compositions, but also another suggestion, which I think is legitimate at some level, is that many of these images are referring to, you know, famous lost Greek panel paintings. So then you have that other layer of reference where, you know, someone coming into your house would be aware of, you know, oh, well, there was this once brilliant painting of Achilles on Skyros by so-and-so, and this is what that's referencing to.
This is right. These are Achilles on Skyros, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Which is a strange and unusual story, which I think
I'm happy to tell it if you'd like, but if not, Achilles on Skyros, it's interesting because Achilles on Skyros is a story that some people aren't as familiar with because it's not from the Iliad, it's from the Achilliad, which is sort of extra stories about Achilles. And it's a popular story in Pompeii and in Rome, in part because it hits on a lot of themes that the Romans like. And the story is that Achilles, who's rendered here, is his mother knows he's going to die if he fights at Troy. And so she hides him on the island of Skyros among the many beautiful daughters of King Lycomedes, who we see here. So he hides among the women, he impregnates one of them, but that's not main part of the story. And Odysseus knows that they can't win the war without Achilles. So they go to Skyros. They've heard that he may be on Skyros, so they go to Skyros to try to reveal him. And in order to do this, clever Odysseus brings weapons and jewelry and you know, gifts for all the daughters. And they assume that Achilles will select the male objects and reveal himself. But Achilles is too smart, and so he makes a big show of putting on the jewelry and dancing around with the women and being just like one of the girls. And then they have someone blow a horn as though battle is oncoming, and then Achilles can't overcome his natural inclination, and he grabs for his sword and his dagger. I mean, his sword and his shield. So that's what's happening right now, is that moment of reveal. And you have, again, Odysseus grabbing him, and then Diomedes grabbing him. And, you know, Achilles is quite surprised. But here he is grabbing those things, even though he's wearing women's clothes. The other thing that's interesting is that you'll see throughout a lot of the images that we see from Pompeii and from Rome more broadly, is that skin color can mean a lot of different things in these worlds, but one thing it indicates is gender. So men are usually rendered with darker skin, redder skin, women with pale, fair skin. And so here we can see Achilles is a man, but he's been hiding acting as a woman. So he has he has women's skin tone, and that's really highlighted by the dark skin of Diomedes and Odysseus.
Right.
So this is sort of this moment of, you know, Romans are very interested in when one thing becomes another. What is the difference between male and female? You know, drunk and sober, inside, outside, all of those sorts of tipping points. And also, of course, so that's sort of something that this is in keeping with the sorts of stories they're interested in.
Which are not really quite Greek. They're not the same kind of idealist that you would, you know, works that you would think of from Athens. They sort of bring the gods low, humanize them, show them vulnerable, which just seems very Roman. And yet, you know, there were Greek painters there and Greek artists who were there. So it seems like there's a sort of adaptation of the Greek, you know, and for a long time, people just thought, well, the Roman art's kind of just sort of decadent, not as good Greek art. And yet the more you talk and the more people study, it really kind of breaks off and does its own thing.
Yes.
It has its own interests, if you will.
Definitely. And stories even, and I think you're very right to say, and again, this kind of more old-fashioned idea, but one that remains sort of spoken or unspoken in a lot of ways, is that Roman art is derivative. It's sort of, there's nothing really creative, or, you know, and it's kind of fatuous at some level, you know, that the Greeks made these sort of gorgeous restrained things, and then the Romans came and, you know, just kind of messed with it. And I mean, that's an overstatement, but honestly, not so much of one sometimes. And I think that what's really important is to emphasize the uniquely Roman character of these things. That even if a story has its origin in something Greek at some level, it is the moments that they're rendering, the ways that they're looking at that story are very, very different.
Right.
And so with one, and then of course there are stories that are not Greek, that are Roman and relate very much to sort of Roman history and Roman really current events almost. And so this piece would be one of them, which I think is one of the most complicated pieces in the show, which I can talk about, or we can move on to something else.
Yeah. Well, let's leave that up. I just wanted to ask about a couple of things that you mentioned. So you said we do have some contracts. So we know some things about how these paintings were commissioned and so forth. Were the artists, would you call them a guild or artisans? Were they people who were enslaved? Were they brought from Greece? And how were contracts sort of enforced, if we know anything about that? I mean, you could write them and say, well, I'm going to, you know, were they signed by the people who commissioned them? What do we know kind of about that?
Yeah, so we don't know as much as we would like to about the identities of the people within the workshops. So the assumption that some of them are Greek is made sort of based mostly on names and, you know, different names in the area, and also, you know, again, the fact that there was a strong Greek presence in the Bay of Naples. Whether or not people were enslaved in all likelihood, enslaved people were also part of these teams, whether or not they were on their own or whether or not they worked in concert with those who weren't. It's hard to say, as with all things as with so many things in the ancient world. We're looking at the type of information that we have is that was thought important by the high elite. So to them, potentially, like the identity of their house painter wasn't of great concern to them.
Right.
And so they don't record so much about it, unfortunately. Right. But so there's a lot more questions than answers when it comes to this stuff. As for enforcement of contracts, Rome had a very robust sort of legal system and means of sort of both writing and enforcing sort of contracts. But I think much in the way that we would now, if you had if you wanted to challenge something, you would go through those sorts of channels in order to do that. No. But I think the question of who the artists were and is the one that I wish we knew more about. Also about how much control did the individual artist have over how the painting ultimately looked. We also don't really know whether or not, we assume on some level that you would, as a homeowner, say, well, I would like an Achilles on Skyros, or and I saw it at so-and-so's house and I want it to look like this. Or would the workshop then say to you, okay, you want an Achilles on Skyros? You can have it like this, or you can have it like this. Would you prefer this or would you prefer that? How much do you want to spend on pigment? How much, what I mean? I think that we wish we had those conversations to see who is driving them and who, how much play there was there. Right. Because some scenes.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Because some scenes show up again and again and again, right. And then some scenes are singular. Right. So then that begs the question, like, whose idea was that? Why was that so important?
Is this a singular scene, the one you're looking at now?
Yeah, this would be an example of one. And this scene, and it's why it's so difficult to interpret. The scene has this large central figure seated on an ivory throne, and then it has a little boat in it, and then this woman who has an elephant headdress on, an elephant hat with the little trunk and horns and ears, and then this woman who has significantly darker skin than any other figure in the piece. The story here is not immediately evident, but this person is Dido, Queen Dido of Carthage, and the story is that Queen Dido comes to Carthage, and she and Aeneas build up Carthage into this incredible city, in Carthage in modern day Tunisia. And Aeneas then leaves her because he must to found Rome, and she commits suicide. Here is Aeneas leaving her. Right. Here is Dido. These two figures don't make a ton of sense. We don't have any real reason to understand, that they're not sort of figures in the story. Some people would say they're attendants. Some people have even suggested maybe they're Dido's sisters. These are sort of not really clear, because this elephant hat iconography is not paralleled elsewhere for women in this way. And the darker skin tone of this figure, which suggests perhaps she's a Black African, Black Africans tend to be represented in very specific ways, in very specific types of scenes in Roman painting, and not this type. So it's really unusual. And so when we have these unusual sort of inclusions, we're just not sure what it could possibly mean. Generally speaking, I think, and some people used to say, well, this is a personification of Asia, and this is a personification of Africa. But that's looking much more toward later, and particularly Renaissance images of the personifications of places. So instead, the suggestion is that you can see also this woman is holding an ivory tusk, which is either a drinking vessel or a musical instrument. But so there's a lot of ivory and there's all these unusual figures. And so the suggestion is, which I think is broadly probably the closest, is that these figures are meant to help reinforce the Carthaginian location of the story. That Carthage is known for their use of elephants in battle and in other, and so that this is all meant to say this is Africa, this is this sort of place in the Mediterranean, and this is Carthage.
Right.
The reason that that would be interesting to Romans at the time is that the Romans had been involved in the Punic Wars for a very long time with Carthage. And so what this story sets up for them is that there's a mythical reason, there's a mythical precedent for a more contemporary political event. So you have Aeneas, again, like the problems between Carthage and Rome go back to Aeneas and Dido. There, you know, it's even this story would be meaningful to them, perhaps.
Right. So this has that sort of then and now kind of feel, but there are other paintings like the banquet scene I'm thinking of, and some of the still lifes of fish and things, and there's one gorgeous, very small one of a scene along a wharf, and there are fishermen and everything. So there were paintings of sort of contemporary life as well. It seems like, and there it is. That this is a great one. We need to talk about this.
Everybody's nightmare party guest.
There it is, right? And where and you have to say where this painting, I know, but where this painting was in the house and maybe why. But please, yeah, I'd love to hear more about this, which is a painting of sort of it's everyday life in this kind of milieu.
Yeah, this painting comes from a dining room, even though it might not be very appetizing for people. You can see that what we have here is sort of the traditional three couches of a dining room in a Roman household. So you have 1, 2, 3 sort of set up in a U, and people who are guests of the house. This is probably the host. Enjoying a banquet. These smaller figures are enslaved people, in all likelihood enslaved children. And one of them is supporting a man who is already becoming sick from overindulgence. So these sorts of scenes, we really wanted to, we actually start the exhibition with this scene because it gives you a sense that all of the paintings in the show were sort of in the fabric of the house. Things were happening around them, and they were wed to a very specific place and therefore a specific audience in the house. That's something we intuitively understand in our own homes, but when we place them back in the ancient world, it may seem a little bit more remote. But here we have not only scenes like this can sort of reinforce what social behavior is appropriate in a space, not in both positive and negative ways. So again, this figure is sort of a cautionary tale. You will have we're wonderful hosts. You will be generously offered everything you want, but let's not do this. So there's sort of that play, but also it's sort of helping to remind people, what is appropriate in this space and how you behave in this space.
Right. And there's inscriptions, which you can't see in this picture, but they're sort of scratched in.
Yeah. So there's above this figure, which is he's holding a vessel to drink from. It says, "I drink." So these are letters that actually after the painting was completed were scratched into the wall. Now, who did this? We're not sure. At what point after it was finished it was done. These sort of graffiti that we see throughout Pompeii and oftentimes on paintings usually relate in some way to the painting itself. This is very literal, and this person's saying, "I think." So it's sort of like these two people are talking, and you get the sense that this person is sort of gnawing the ear off of this person. This character is saying, "Be well," sort of like a welcome. So he's the host. So you have their sort of, almost like little word bubbles. But they weren't seemingly the intention of the artist. They were added after, but in the life of, obviously before 79. So you have this sense though that people are engaging with these works in a very direct way, and making them active.
And they're very, I mean, you mentioned before the sort of theater of it. And there seems to be a theater that, the artists are, this is advertising for the artists as well, saying, right, we did this, and then we're gonna hope somebody comes to this banquet and sees that and wants something. So I mean, it's an entire kind of network or economy of painters and painting, it seems like. Would you say that? Would you?
Definitely. I mean, I think that, like in any, I mean, Pompeii is not that big a place, and like in many communities, there were going to be the elite in Pompeii who summered there, and, you would know the same people. And so these houses were showcases, I think, not only for the homeowners, but also for the workshops themselves.
Right.
Yeah, so I think definitely you want
I
to
mean,
define it.
and there's so much attention. You showed an earlier one with the sort of architectural painting, and it seems like all of that is just kind of a tour de force of perspective and of making a room seem bigger than it is, or as you said, bringing the outside inside, and painting, a vine covered wall inside, which sort of blurs the distinctions between outside and inside. All of which is a great calling card for a group of artists to say, look what we can do.
Yeah. No, certainly. But I think that the trompe l'oeil sort of fooling you, and I mean, the Romans write a lot about artifice and the nature of artifice, and that's sort of something that comes out in different ways in the pieces themselves, both through these sort of optical plays, but also I think sort of in like kind of comical little cheeky ways that are playful. So I always love the sense of humor, I think, that you see in a lot of these works.
Right. All right, somebody asked, are there other dining room paintings, or is this one kind of unique at this point?
No, there are lots of paintings. So one thought about how you decided how to use the resources that you had when decorating your home is that you'd put the most important things in the spaces that would have the most play. So you've got dining room. The dining room is the space that often has some of the most elaborate and highest quality painting in the houses. Also the very front part of the house near the door, obviously, where kind of everyone's going to come through the door. There are this scene of kind of like a scene of contemporary people at a banquet exists, but is not super duper common. They show up in different places, but it's interesting another major piece which we see from a dining room space is it has some similar themes, is this scene. This is the dining room of the house of Marcus Lucretius. So this is a plan of that villa. It's huge. It actually was made by the joining of two villas. And this painting comes from the room 16, which is the dining room. And here you can see this is where this painting once stood, right on this wall. This is a painting again of Hercules and Omphale. So the story of them is, that Hercules has to become enslaved to someone, the Queen of Lydia, and Omphale purchases him, and they go to a feast for Dionysus, and Hercules gets too drunk, as he always does, and ends up swapping clothes with Omphale. And here she is holding his club and has his lion skin on, and he's in a bad way. And so this is I love this piece because, again, it has that sort of cautionary tale, but also this message of abundance and good hosting and fun and all of that. Also, it's really theatrical because the figures are as big as we are. And so you really have this sense that they're in your space. What's more is that this is a digital reconstruction of the place where this came from, but you can see this big window that you saw in goes out onto this extremely fancy garden that they had. Now, the revel that Dionysus and Omphale are supposed to be at is in sort of a garden space. So the other conceit that's happening here is that you kind of, if you're in a party in this room, is that Hercules and Omphale were partying right here, and they kind of staggered in from the very garden. So there's this real sense of sort of embedding the imagery in the architecture and doing that in kind of an illusionistic way.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
I know we're coming up on the hour. I just want to ask one quick question about your own work and in Egyptology. What kind of similarities are there? You said, in how some of that work was done. Were there guilds? Are there schools or studios that you have sort of seen?
Yeah, that's a big, exciting question. I think that Egypt, what's interesting about Egypt is how different the character of or how different the types of information we have from there is. There are two main things that speak a lot to this question. And one is a site called Deir el-Medina, which is adjacent to the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. And this is a workman's village. This was actually made specifically for those artists who worked in the Valley of the Kings to live in while they were working there. So we have an incredible amount of, drawings, sketches on ostraca. And what's really interesting too is that, the way that you built your tomb as a king was that you went big and you kept building and you kept going, and then you died, and most of the time it wasn't finished. So, and then the resources were moved on to the building of the next king's tomb. So we also have this incredible sort of similar thing where you see unfinished work. And so you see beneath the finished paintings, you see the grid lines and the sketches and all of these different things. On the sculpture side, there's a site called the Workshop of Tutmos, which is where the famous Nefertiti head is from. And this was a sculpture workshop, which has works that were in different stages of completion. So those are the two sites that give us a really exciting insight into process in Egyptian sculpture and painting during the New Kingdom. So it's not, we don't have that same information all throughout, but but we do have those two sites, which are sort of just ones to call out as really exciting places to consider those questions.
Fantastic. We may have to have you back and talk about that.
Be careful what you wish for.
Any other questions, please? Thank you very much, Claire. I'm going to turn it back over to Penelope for a minute. Thank you so much. It was fantastic. Fantastic.
Thank you for listening, and come see our next show in the fall.
What's the next show?
It's really exciting material from 11 different Balkan countries that date from the Neolithic to the Iron Age. So it's sculpture and armor and weapons and jewelry and all sorts of really exciting material that we don't get to see a lot here. So we're excited.
Fantastic. Thank you again.
Thank you.
I'll turn it back to you for a minute.
Thank you so much. This has just been amazing, and it sounds like there's a lot more we could dig into, but for today we will wrap up. So thank you so much for being here with us today. If you enjoyed this program, please come to the next evening with Hulings Salon on July the 14th. That's with Peter Trippi from Fine Art Connoisseur and collectors Gilda Temple and Gordon O'Brien. And also a reminder, just please support CHF. We offer these programs for free, but they're not free to deliver, and we just appreciate everything that you give to us. clarkhulingsfoundation.org/give. I also want to let people know to mark their calendars for November 20th, 2022. It would have been Clark Hulings' 100th birthday. We're about to kick off a major celebration, Jim Balestrieri's Hulings book, a virtual reality exhibit, and in-person events, including a birthday party in Santa Fe and exhibits in local museums. So just take a moment, jot that down, watch out for all of that. And I also wanted to thank Shirley Holland again for her support of the series. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in July. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.